Oh, hello.
Oh, hi.
Hey, Vern. How you
Hi,
doing?
Stephanie. And
Hey,
hello, everybody
everyone.
out there. Welcome.
Thank you all for coming to our now third installment of the New York City Poetry Festival streaming reading series. I'm Stephanie Berger. I'm the CEO of the Poetry Society of New York. This is my co-host, Bernadette. I'm like, oh, it's mirrored. Fun. So this is my co-host, Bernadette. She's one of our program and event coordinators. She plans the Poetry Brothel events on the West Coast for us, and we're so excited to be here. The goal of these streaming events is basically just to try to conjure some of the magic of the New York City Poetry Festival, which we were so sad to have to cancel this year because of COVID. So yeah, we just want to connect with other poets and hear them read their poems and talk about poetry. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the New York City Poetry Festival, it happens every year on the last weekend in July. It's on Governor's Island, and it's totally free and open to the public. And we basically invite any organization that produces poetry events or publishes poetry books, a poetry magazine, a collective, a workshop group. Everyone is invited to come and present their format on one of the festival stages. And it's just so much fun. It's like the most inclusive poetry event I've probably ever been to. 14,000 people have come in the past in a single year. And, we're looking forward to 2021. And we encourage you to make donations if you feel so inclined. So with tonight's event, we have decided to partner with Blue Flower Arts. And Blue Flower Arts, it was founded by a longtime friend of ours, Allison Granucci. It is a speakers agency, and they focus on bringing poetry to life, basically. It's all about spoken poetry. And they represent honestly the best poets in the world who are alive currently, including tonight's readers, who are Mark Doty, Major Jackson, and Valjina Mort. They have actually, I know, yay! They have actually all been former or upcoming headliners of the New York City Poetry Festival. So I'm really excited that they're here with us to commemorate the event and to hang out and talk poems. So yeah, for those of you that are watching, we're going to do a Q&A after the reading. So if you have any questions for these beautiful humans at all about their poetry or their writing process or their background or anything, you're more than welcome to post those questions in the comments, and we will do everything in our power to talk about them after the reading. And as with any streaming event, occasionally there is a technical difficulty. Just FYI, we are recording all of this. So the entire reading tech difficulties will be posted on our Facebook page after the event. So don't fret if you miss anything. I think that's it. Bernadette, did I forget anything?
No, I think you covered it all, although there may be brief cameos by pets. Just FYI.
That's true. Yes, there is a cat lurking around this apartment right now.
Yeah, so. And I think there are dogs in not just this room, but rooms all over with our readers as well.
Indeed. I'm so excited. So should we jump in? Do you want to introduce Mark for us?
Oh, I get to introduce Mark? Yay.
Yeah, you do.
Awesome. So Mark Doty is the author of 9 books of poetry, including Deep Lane, Fire to Fire, New and Selected Poems, which won the 2008 National Book Award, and My Alexandria, which is one of my personal favorites, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the T.S. Eliot Prize in the UK. He is the author of 4 memoirs, the New York Times bestselling What is the Grass?, Dog Years, Firebird, and Heaven's Coast, as well as a book about craft and criticism, The Art of Description, World into Word. Doty has received 2 NEA fellowships, Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundation fellowships, a Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Award, and the Witter Byner Prize. Oh my God, and he's just one of my absolute favorite poets. I'm so excited. I can't wait. Stephanie, are you ready? Everybody out there, are you ready? Please welcome Mark Doty.
Yay! Welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Welcome.
I really love the stuff that the New York Poetry Society does. Good energy. The events are so much fun, and I'm very grateful to be here in this good company too, so thank you. I am reading from my apartment in Chelsea in New York City. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've been thinking about an apartment building as a kind of repository of time. When I moved here into this building, there were people who'd been here for 30 years before I got here. There were people who had arrived a few years before, and then there were people who've come after me. It becomes to feel like a layer cake of history in some way. I have written about New York in the past, but in a kind of broader sense, the wider vista of things. And I find myself wanting to look closely at the building, the neighborhood, people in it. And so I'm going to read you some poems that are set sort of right here. The first one has to do with the co-op this building is. A corporation, which is owned by those of us who live here. This is called Renovation. Pam lived 40 years in apartment 1 and ran our co-op with an iron hand. She ruled by simply keeping needed information to herself. 2 doors opened from her place to the hall. If I came down late the year the buzzer didn't work, to greet some man I'd soon come to know, or fumbled hopeless with my keys at 4 a.m., I felt her eye fixed behind a peephole that bent the hallway light around me to a ring of, not shame exactly, but stubborn residual embarrassment. 2 months dead, she seems to hover still, vigilant, disapproving not on moral grounds, but because you never know. Abrasive, she hated conflict. If anyone stood up to her at a meeting, she'd cry. She'd earned her MSW at Hunter years before, and afternoons saw clients in a dim, cat-haunted parlor beside the untouched old upright so heavy the floor beneath it sank. I'd see her sometimes, ushering them out, beaming at each an utter benevolence so at odds with what I knew of her it made me dizzy. Sick, past 80, leaning one night against the hallway stairs she hadn't climbed in years. She reached to touch me through the balustrade. Instead, she was utterly tired of life. Her daughter flew in from a distant state and had 4 decades of the apartment's contents hauled away. Diploma, letters, a studio portrait of her mother, flirtatious and middle-aged, and accepted an offer, $1.5 million in cash. A floor through, after all, with an airless private garden in the back. The renovation's nearly done. I took a tour, and here's what startled me. That rueful, provoking, sarcastic spirit presided still. For that money, she thought, it ought to be beautiful, modern, nothing for ghosts to catch on. It's hard enough to leave. Don't you know by now I loved you all? So there is 1 dog in this apartment now. Not so long ago, there were 2. The one who's no longer here was named George. Still is. This is a breakup poem. I swore I would not write divorce poems, and this one just happened. Maybe it's the only one, we'll see. George was a Bedlington Terrier, a small and rather peculiar breed. You'll hear about that here. Goodbye, George. Your upturned face is fresh with greeting as it ever was, the rare day I see you now. And you still like to stand, almost weightless paws planted on my knees, bringing your eyes inches closer to mine, and firmly rub your muzzle against my trousers, a happy show of affection and regard. Most mysterious of dogs, you keep to yourself. When you're demonstrative, it goes straight to the heart. Those, in this apartment, are locked. Here, love strictly between men and dogs. I try not to speak for your father. Silly, I know, but the word feels right for ease and irony. shorthand for a relation too little understood to name, even after 40,000 years bending wildness our way. Could a single drop of wolf blood run in any vein of yours? Your forebears plunged their snouts deep down the rat holes of Northumbria, eyes set wide to stay unbitten. A guy on the sidewalk took a look at you once, straight on, fresh from the groomer, and called out, "Dude, your dog doesn't have a face." Of the misfortunes that have dogged your little life, this may be the worst. You're his. He wouldn't allow you to be ours. I hope you tap in him reserves of loyalty, the wit to imagine what it might be to be you. I hope he finds you better than he did me, that you teach him to enjoy taking you for a walk. It would help if you'd bark a little less. George, I'm glad you couldn't translate a word of our misery raging above your head, but I wish I could tell you I tried. One father's better than none at all, and you're a brave boy, that trusting way you drape across the arm of the couch, half of you dangling down, sure of a soft landing should you fall. But on the street, you were always so afraid, as if you knew you couldn't really trust us to keep you from harm, or trust there'd be an us at all. If sometime I'm allowed to take you for a walk, I hope you bark your heart out at some passing stranger, as you used to do, so I'll know that not every blessed thing has changed. Or maybe it has, and you'll go racing to the landing and show me by your posture and alertness that it's eagerness now that sends you bounding out the stairs up toward the door. So I wanted to read you just a little bit of prose from this new book. It's called What is the Grass of Walt Whitman in My Life? And it's a difficult book to excerpt because it is a lot of things. It's a study of Walt Whitman's poetry, of his greatest poems. It's a meditation on why I felt so profoundly connected to him. It's an attempt to look very closely at the most extraordinary poems, I think, most extraordinary American poems of their century, right there with Miss Dickinson. These two are demigods. And it's also a book about myself, looking at my common fixations with Mr. Whitman, where our obsessions overlap, and how I felt his presence. So I can't really represent it, but what I'm going to do is read you a little section. It's about 2.5 pages. This is the first writers' conference I went to, Santa Cruz, California, in 1978. And the poet who appears here, William Everson, was better known as Brother Antoninus. He was a beat poet who left a religious order in order to pursue poetry and lovemaking. When I was 25, I went to a writers' conference, my first on the California coast, on an idyllic Santa Cruz campus of yellow grassland pouring down the slopes to the sea. There were workshops and readings, and a good deal of staying up till one could drink no more, convivial nights of long talks, most often about our wish to become ourselves as writers, whatever that might mean, about longing, our deep desire to feel complete, real to ourselves. I made a raft of friends, a lean and intense fiction writer trying to find her way inside a novel that eluded her, the West Coast editor of Playgirl, a joyful Zoftig beauty who wore metallic caftans and shared with me her delicious, slender little cigars. It was 1978. I was still married and secretive about my longing for men, but I had a mad crush on a warm, bearish man whose every gesture seemed to spread sweetness and good humor. Like the Playgirl editor, he occupied space with notable delight in being a body. Toward the end of the gathering, he told me in an embrace flushed with wine and heat that if he hadn't been having an affair with the woman across the hall from my room, he had been with me. That would have been possible. I was dazed and so happy with the idea that such a thing could have happened, I honestly didn't mind so much that it didn't. There was another set of events too, richer and stranger. The poet William Everson, the elder, animating spirit of the place, who had once been Brother Antoninus, a Dominican monk who renounced the order to pursue both art and pleasure, offered a series of meditative lectures, a loosely structured performance over several mornings called The Birth of a Poet. At an hour on the early side for apprentice writers, still groggy, we would troop down the hill toward a space deemed conducive to inwardness. Could it really have been called the Kiva, or have I invented that? Everson himself was Whitmanic, streaming white hair, generous beard and eyebrows to match. He wore old jeans and a shearling vest over his white shirt, fleece turned inward against the coastal damp, the leather beaded and sketched in dark lines with animals and stars. It had been given to him, he said, by his friends among the Kiowa. In one of the two pockets in front resided the smallest bottle, a pint of the Jack Daniels he would not be without. Much of what he said, I've forgotten. Certainly he described his spiritual vocation, how the calling to the monastic life and the calling to poetry were in fact the same thing, perhaps misheard at first, understood differently over time. He talked about his hero, Robinson Jeffers, the great poet of that coastline, a fierce and lonely man with a touch of granite both in his profile and in the chill around his heart, who lashed out at his own species and wrote a beautiful Hurt Hawk, because he could not bear the pain we inflict on one another, or the injury that must have been done to him. As great poets do, he found a way to transmute the personal wound into something larger. His rejection of human company became a way to love stone and wind and time, the grand elemental forces made visible on the bluff in Carmel, where he built his own stone tower of a house. The surf and stones of Big Sur, if not larger than time or quite outside of it, were of a scale commensurate with the ages. I used to think I could never take pleasure in imagining the Earth after the Anthropocene, but as the damage we've done grows clearer every day, I find myself in greater sympathy with Jeffers' position. His poems take comfort in the world going on without us, our petty scrawlings on the face of the planet all swept away. Even stone towers? Probably. Like Whitman, Everson was also a printer. He told us about his printing press, the cold metal of it, the way setting type brought one closer to the body of a poem, how he made an edition of Jeffers' poems, each copy housed in a case of Monterey cypress. Into the cover of each he then laid a polished square of granite from Tor House itself. Many sips of whiskey between all this, pauses while Everson waited for the next thread to come clear, a little shuffling, circling dance, and coughs and pacing, a sip of whiskey, and in a while, a new direction emerging from the last. Here is what he said that I've never forgotten. The movement of the soul is vertical, he claimed, descending into the world, and when we become incarnate, as Christ the model and exemplar of the human form did, then our vertical motion intersects with time, with the horizontality of the temporal world. When a book is made, then, the life of the maker is nailed, as it were, to the intersection of those two lines. In the book, he said, the self is fixed, made concrete. The book is the intersection of the soul and time. So I'm going to end with a short poem, a poem that has to do with this moment. It's called Imperative. He's my age, the dark man leaning against this empty storefront window, hair and beard dusted white, face impressed with a frazzled net of lines. He doesn't attempt to please, nor seem in need, but practices all day a toneless, steady neutrality, repeating his monosyllabic plea, change. In this way, he resembles a prisoner who's learned to show almost no deference to his guards, nothing of abasement. He's a barely rippling tank of dark water, superbly contained. He submits to a precise degree he's had years to gauge. Change, he says, all day. Fixing his spot on 7th, the word a key, he tries again, as if hoping this time the tumblers might turn. Change, at night more driven, as if he meant to chip away at something, the word falling hard on the sidewalks, flint and shadow, ringing on the pavement like a dime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's such a pleasure having you here.
So incredible. I always feel so moved when in the presence of Mark.
Don't you? Yeah. I feel
Always.
moved.
I remember hearing him read for the very first time at Hunter College, and just, I was an undergrad, just so wowed, just so amazed. And then again at Sarah Lawrence, and just, following him around New York City, wherever he would go, almost like a fangirl,
I love it. Yeah. I mean, he's one of the best. So, it's such an honor and a delight to have him here. And I can't wait to talk to him about those poems after this. So
I know, I'm excited too. Who's next?
So next we have Major Jackson.
Woo.
Major Jackson is the author of 5 collections of poetry: The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, and Leaving Saturn, which was awarded the Cave Canem Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Poetry, obviously. His poems and essays have appeared in the American Poetry Review, Callaloo, The New Yorker, Plowshares, Poetry, Tin House, and in Best American Poetry. He served as a guest editor of Best American Poetry in 2019, and that was a freaking excellent collection. Nice work, man. Jackson is a recipient of a Pushcart Prize and has been honored by the Pew Fellowship in the Arts and the Witter Byner Foundation in conjunction with the Library of Congress. Please welcome the illustrious Major Jackson.
Oh, how terrific to be with you. We were supposed to be together in March, but we all know what happened. In fact, the Salon of Poetry Society of New York was to launch this book, The Absurd Man. But it wasn't to be, so I'm very happy to be in your presence here. I'm gonna read new poems. I'm gonna risk new poems, and but read a few from The Absurd Man. One of the conceits of the book is kind of breaking the third wall, speaking to the reader, and the interior self speaking to the artist self. And it's a strong belief of mine that I think it was Etheridge Knight who said the poem is not complete until a reader absorbs the poem. This is titled, You Reader. So often I dream of the secrets of satellites, and so often I want the moose to step from the shadows and reveal his transgressions. And so often I come to her body as though she were Lookout Mountain, but give me a farmer's market to park my martyred ass, and I will name all the dirt roads that dead end at the Cubist sculpture called My Infinity. For I no longer light bonfires in the city of adulterers, and no longer smudge the cheeks of debutantes hurriedly floating across the high fruit of night. And yes, I know there is one notable death in any small town, and that is the pig farmer. But listen, at all times, the proud rivers mourn my absence, especially when, like a full moon, you, reader, hidden behind a spray of night blooming, drift in and out of scattered clouds, above lighthouses, producing their artificial calm, just to sweep a chalk of light over distant waters. This is a poem of several poems that contemplates New York. It is called The Flaneur Tins a Well-Like Summer Cocktail. And the ARP, A-R-P, in the first line is Jean Arp, Jean Arp. The Flaneur tins a well-like summer cocktail, curbside on an ARP-like table. He's alone, of course, in the arts district, as it were, legs folded, swaying a foot so that his body seems to summon some deep immensity from all that surrounds. Dusk shadows inching near a late 30-ish couple debating the post-galactic abyss of sex with strangers. Tourists ambling by only to disappear into the street's gloomy mouth. A young Italian woman bending to retrieve a dropped Metro card, its black magnetic strip facing up. A lone speckled brown pigeon breaking from a flock of rock doves, then landing near a crushed fast food wrapper newly tossed by a bike messenger. The man chortling after a sip of flaxen-colored beer, remembering that in the Gospel of John, the body and glory converge, linked to incarnation, and so perhaps we manifest each other. A tiny shower of sparks erupting from the knife sharpener's truck, who daily leans a blade into stone. A cloudscape reflected in the rear windshield of a halted taxi, where inside a trans woman applies auburn lipstick. The warlike insignia on the lapel jacket of a white gloved doorman, who opening a glass door gets a whiff of a dowager's thick perfume and recalls baling Timothy hay as a boy in Albania. The woman distractedly watching a mother discuss Robert Colescott's lurid appropriations of modernist art over Niçoise salad, suddenly frees her left breast from its cup where awaits the blossoming mouth of an infant wildly reaching for a galaxy of milk. The sharp coughs of a student carrying a yoga mat, the day's last light edging high-rises on the west side so that they seem rimmed by fire, just when the man says, and yet amidst the wages we pay, boarding the great carousel of flesh. Here's a new poem, and I'm thinking quite a bit about extended conceits as a method of composing poems, and this one's called It Must Be the Supermarket in Me. It must be the supermarket in me, all lit from inside, full of wide owls and thoughtful shelf stocking, where you'll find my feelings and memories. That's why on the outside I look so ordered and put together. My inner supermarket contains an old world butcher shop with no trace of the slaughter. Shoppers arrive with an unfathomable hunger, which I relieve by offering freshness, quality, and value. Some are penniless and can only fantasize licking their lips at rows of artisanal cheeses and meats behind glass display cases, the cloth-bound bries and goat at ropes of cured salami and prosciutto. Still they taste. I offer free samples at stations throughout my supermarket so people will come to know and like me. In the produce department, many taste my pears and avocados for ripeness. In the floral area, they sniff. Some walk off with my bouquets. I contain cheerful baggers who will escort you to your car. At times, truthfully, I dislike this about myself, forever accommodating. I've not always had a supermarket in me. It began when the church in me lost its congregation. And when I lost my mother's love to stimulants, there is no place for anger in my supermarket. I keep it in the back room with the sign that reads, "No trespassing, employees only." It's a way of being in the world, a self, full of checkout lines and refrigerators, until someone runs through, knocking down pyramids of canned goods, or worse, panic shopping, leaving empty owls. Yes. I'm gonna read two more poems. This is called On Disappearing. I have not disappeared. The boulevard is full of my steps. The sky is full of my thinking. An archbishop prays for my soul. Even though we met only once, and even then he was busy waving at a congregation. The ticking clocks in Vermont sway back and forth as though sweeping up my eyes and my tattoos and my metaphors. And what comes up are the great paragraphs of dust, which also carry motes of my existence. I have not disappeared. My wife quivers inside a kiss. My pulse was given to her many times in many countries. The chunks of bread we dip in olive oil is communion with our ancestors, who also have not disappeared. Their delicate songs I wear on my eyelids. Their smiles have given me freedom, which is a crater I keep falling in. When I bite into the two halves of an orange whose cross-section resembles my lungs, a delta of juices bursts down my chin and like magic makes me appear to those who think I've disappeared. It's too bad war makes people disappear like chess pieces and that prisons turn prisoners into movie endings. When I fade into the mountains on a forest trail, I still have not disappeared, even though its green facade turns my arms and legs into branches of oaks. It is then I belong to a southerly wind, which by now you have mistaken as me, nodding back and forth like a Hasid in prayer, or a mother who's just lost her son to gunfire in Detroit. I have not disappeared. In my children, I see my bulging face pressing further into the mysteries. In a library in Tucson, on a plain above Buenos Aires, on a field where nearby burns a controlled fire, I'm held by a professor, a general, and a photographer. One burns a finely wrapped cigar, then sniffs the scented pages of my books, scouring for the bitter smell of control. I hold him in my mind like a chalice. I have not disappeared. When we talk about limits, we disappear. In Jasper, Texas, you can disappear on a strip of gravel. I am a life in sacred language. Termites toil over a grave, and my mind is a ravine of yesterdays. At a glance from across the room, I wear September on my face, which is eternal and does not disappear, even if you close your eyes once and for all, simultaneously, like two coffins. I normally don't like reading old poems, but given the moment that we're in, I thought I would read that poem, if nothing else, for us to remember what happened in Jasper, Texas, and how we definitely need to heal from these moments, which some people might want to deny. I'm gonna end with this poem. In the 80s, we did the WAP. And I used to love to dance when I was a kid. So it was fun writing this poem. In the 80s, we did the WAP. If you end your crusades for the great race, then I will end my reenactments of flying. And if you lean down to paint, to smell a painted trillium, then I will cast a closer eye on those amber waves. And if you stop killing Black children, then I will turn to the sea and away from your wounded mountains. Who mothered your love of death? Here is a heart-shaped stone to rub when you feel fear rising. Give me anything, an empty can of Pabst, a plastic souvenir, a t-shirt from Daytona. Here is a first edition, the collected poems of Lucille Clifton. Give me an ancient grove and a conversation by a creek, charms to solve my griefs, something that says, you are human, and I will give you the laughter in my brain and the tranquil eyes of my uncles. Show me your grin in the middle of winter. In the 80s, we did the WAP. You too have your dances. It is like stealing light from a flash in the sky. I promise, no one is blaming you. No one is trying to replace you. It's just that you are carrying a tainted clock, calling it European history. Standing in khakis, eyes frightened like a mess of beetles. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you so much, Major. Oh, God, I can't, I'm so sad that we didn't get to have that salon. I'm so excited to talk to you more about this afterwards. Bern, how you doing?
Wow, these poems are really moving me and just so important. I love this. It must be the supermarket in me poem too. Like that line, when I lost my mother's love to stimulants, just I started like welling up with tears in this like really immense way. And I think, what I love about poetry is that when it sounds like that could be my poem, not that I wrote that poem, but it could be my story. And so when I hear Major Jackson read, I feel my story in those poems, and it really moved me. So thank you, Major Jackson, and all of that. I'm sorry, I'm just so emotional. It's really, really beautiful. And That's what great poetry does. It creates that connection to, the world and to the people. So I just, thank you so much for that.
That's making me emotional. For some reason,
Yeah.
I glommed onto post-galactic sex with strangers. I was just like, that could be my poem. You ever have that feeling?
Yes, totally. And then of course that last poem, just it's all just so important, and poetry is so important, and it really is, the music of the literary world. So I just can't help but be so grateful for Major Jackson and Mark Doty and our next incredible poet, Valjina Mort.
Yay!
I know, I can't wait. She is the author of Factory of Tears and Collected Body, Copper Canyon Press. She is the recipient of the Lannan Foundation Fellowship, the Bess Hogan Prize from Poetry, Amy Clampett Fellowship, the Gulf Translation Prize, and the Glenna Luce Prairie Schooner Award. Born in Minsk, Belarus, she teaches at Cornell and writes in English and Belarusian. Valjina Mort's new book, Music for the Dead and Resurrected, is forthcoming from FSG. I can't wait to read that book. I love books about the dead and resurrection. I'm really excited about all of this. Please, everybody, welcome Valjina Mort.
Thanks, Valjina.
Hi. Hello, thank you so much to everybody for tuning in. Thank you for my friends, my beautiful friends at the New York City Poetry Fest and Blue Flower Arts. And it's a great honor and, total love to read with Mark and Major here. I'm going to read 3 poems from my upcoming collection. I already have the galleys, but in the spirit of a virtual reading, I'll read digital from the screen. The first poem is called Guest, and it's an invitation to Minsk, my home city. Minsk is a city full of statues. Gigantic statues of poets stand next to the statues of Soviet officials who were often the murderers of other poets. A Russian poet, Vladimir Khlebnikov, writes somewhere that statues is the language that the state uses to speak to its people, which is a phrase that I think rings very important in the current American moment. A particular statue that I address in this poem is to a beloved Belarusian poet, Maxim Bogdanovich, who died about 100 years ago at the tender age of 25. And about 20 years after his death, most of Belarusian writers were murdered by the Soviet officials. Their manuscripts were burned, and several living generations of writers were made disappeared. There are no books of theirs and no monuments to them. Guest. Come in, Maxim. This is Minsk, choked under a pillow of clouds. Here you are, a statue in a heavy coat. Here all monuments wear coats, not wool, but linden bark coats in bee fur collars. In their pockets, monuments keep belts, and under collars, monuments have necks. In winter, shadows insulate the walls, window and cracks are plucked with shadows. In museums, coats and nooses on display, and water is pickle juice. Come in, Maxim. Apartment blocks are wrapped in ammunition staircases, and window medals sparkle through the night. Every building here is a kind of bust. An elevator ascends like vomit. For furniture, there is a stump. Come in, Maxim, come flying. Sit on a stump, don't cast a shadow, keep your coat on, and please come flying. A comet statue flying, a comet medal to Minsk. The next poem I'm going to read is called Self-Portrait with Madonna on Pravda Avenue. Pravda is a Russian word that means truth, which was the name of a Soviet newspaper. And so having grown up on the Truth Avenue, I always mistrust the word truth, especially when it's capitalized. Before I could worry about the American elections coming in November that are pretty unprecedented, going to be pretty unprecedented, I'm all tensed up about this week's Belarusian presidential elections that are also very unprecedented, because there is a real civil awakening in a country where for 26 years, elections have been a ritual in rigging, a ritual in in electing the same man. The people who are doing the rigging at the polling stations are mostly our Belarusian teachers. So this poem, Self-Portrait with Madonna on Pravda Avenue, takes place in a Soviet school in a winter dark, and the students are having their class in world art. Whose mouth did you take me right out from? The mouth over the street, named after the mouthpiece of propaganda. Of the empire's fall I heard on the radio while waiting for a weather forecast. Swings became guillotines. In the fluorescent classroom, pubescent critics presided over a teacher who wrote on the blackboard with a tiny piece of a human bone. In that starched light, she blinded our acned faces with Raphael's Madonna. We knew her bleached skin by the smell. Corridors disinfected with chlorine daily to cover the reek of urine and sweat. Chlorine, opium of the pupils, granted us purity, absolution of sins of our grandfathers whose heroic deeds festered under torn book covers. Public buses dug through the dark like the hormonal moles. Her docile features didn't seem beautiful. Like hush money, she was handing the child a breast. The breast formed a kind of courtyard between their bodies. What was his suffering to us? The child held on to the breast so as not to Humpty Dumpty into the classroom where chlorine long ago replaced speech. In tiny offices reeking of glue, bureaucrats picked their teeth in search of a proper certificate to this strange birth. A shot of snow into the blood-thick dark, swings become guillotines, the city of iron and irony. The empire fell, then the snow fell, then the mother ripped her dress and produced a breast stripe with 30 silver droplets of milk. In this starched light, on Madonna's chest, the child already looked crucified, the nail head of the nipple next to his little fist. The art teacher looked starved. She despised us, as did the star as it stared down in judgment. She said, "Go." Like a worm, her thin mouth tried to bury itself under her skin as she spoke. A city of iron and irony, a nest of snow larvae, my city, each snow maggot I kiss. The mouth of Pravda Avenue I kiss. I kiss each radio announcer on the mouth. I kiss each radio announcer on her iron mouth. History waits as we kiss. And the last poem I'm going to read is called Bus Stops, Ars Poetica. And the reason why bus stops are my Ars Poetica is because my poetic prosody is the rhythm of the public transportation. I grew up taking public buses in a city where each bus stop is named after a national murderer. And so these bus routes are really the routes of violence that we in Belarus, and well, I think a lot of people here in the States too, keep circling around. Bus stops, Ars Poetica. I hope you can understand my accent. If you don't, you'll have to get my book. Not books, but a street opened my mouth like a doctor's spatula. One by one, streets introduced themselves with the names of national murderers. In the state archives, covers hardened like scabs of the ledgers. Inside a tiny apartment, I built myself into a separate room. Inside a tiny apartment, I built myself into a separate room, peopled it with the Calibans of plans for the future. Future that runs on the schedule of public buses. From the zoo to the circus, what future? What is your alibi for these ledgers, these streets, this apartment future? In the purse that held through 7 wars the birth certificates of the dead, my grandmother hid from me chocolates. The purse opened like a screaming mouth. The purse opened like a screaming mouth. Its 2 shiny buckles watched me through doors, through walls, through jazz. Who has taught you to be a frightening face, purse? I kiss your buckles. I swear myself your subject. August, apples. I have nobody. August, for me, a ripe apple is a brother. For me, a 4-legged table is a pet. In the temple of supermarket, I stand like a candle in the line to the priestesses who preserve the knowledge of sausage prices, the virginity of milk cartons. My future, small change. Future that runs on the schedule of public buses. Streets introduce themselves with the names of national murderers. I build myself into a separate room where memory, the illegal migrant in time, cleans up after imagination. Bus stops, my future, an empty seat. In a room where memory strips the beds, linens that hardened like scabs on the mattresses, I kiss little apples, my brothers. I kiss the buckles that watch us through walls, through years, through jazz, chocolates from a purse that held, through 7 wars, the birth certificates of the dead. Hold me, brother apple. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Valjina. By the way,
beautiful.
your accent just makes me like that much more enraptured by everything that you say. That's probably, I'm just like, I feel like it's an advantage, honestly, that you have. So,
That's a
wow.
good thing.
How about you, Bern?
Oh, wow. Just, thinking about each bus stop being named after a murderer, like just that idea. And then the repetition of those words about the bus, about the chocolate, like those memories, those visceral feelings. Again, just these stories that resonate in such a way that just invoke all of this emotion. I'm just so grateful to be here with you and to have your writing, not silenced, and to be able to have writers that are able to say these things and talk about these things that in many places aren't allowed, and how grateful we are for that. So thank you so much for that, really.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here.
Yeah, of course. Let's bring Major Jackson and Mark Doty back in here. I'd love to chat with everybody.
Yeah, that's great.
It looks like we're missing Mark. Hopefully Mark will come back. Maybe a little technical difficulty. It wouldn't be a streaming reading without a technical difficulty. And that's what I always say.
True.
Every day I say that. I wake up in the morning, I'm like, it wouldn't be a streaming reading. Major, Valjina, hi. So both of your readings were so beautiful. I'm delighted that you're here. I thought that we could start with a question from our audience because I thought that would be fun. Emmy Bergquist, the delightful Mona Mayhem, has asked, have you noticed any shifts in the poetry/literary world throughout your career? And if so, how have they affected your own writing? I'll leave it up there so we can think about that for a second.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, this is the most sophisticated Zoom reading I've ever been a part of. And the question pops up right there. Wow. Good question. I think it's, for me, it's been more, there definitely have been changes and very, very positive changes in the literary world, but more interestingly to me is the changes in our day-to-day lives, and not just in the immediate. The immediate is a huge, huge shift. But what I'm contemplating is something that that Valjina mentioned earlier, which is this truth, capital T, and how what's being inserted as truth, or at least the criticism of the lives of people and telling their own truth, gets questioned as and reported as fake news. And so every piece of writing that comes from poets bear greater weight, bear a kind of a gesture towards meaning that is sacred. And that's what I'm finding, at least in my own life, is that what we are up against is propaganda, and what we're up against, which poets, I guess, have been historically, what we've done is to kind of bear witness and tell a different version of the news, quoting Pound there.
Yeah. Valjina, do you have anything you want to say about this topic?
Well, to just go with what Major was saying, I think that certainly American poetry has been going through a great shift, I think, in the past years. I think that some kind of, while some people were building walls, I think that some kind of walls fell down between American poets and American readers. But also as somebody who, I hope I did not bring the authoritarian regime to your country, but as somebody who comes from a place like that, I could say that, of course, there's more and more readership, the more authoritarian the government gets, the larger the word T in truth grows, the more people turn to poetry in order to look for a language that is not somebody else's. But it's really a paradox, right? Because when we read a poem, we breathe through somebody else's mind, somebody else's words. But what these words are awakening are our own inner voice. That is the only true, with the smallest letter and many, many, many letters, because there are so many of those truths that are there. But otherwise, with this question, I would say that the only poetry world I know very well is the one inside of myself. And that has gone through many shifts. I've learned to read much more. I've slowed down as a poet and then picked up again. It's constantly changing and it's constantly different.
Yeah.
I don't know if Mark saw the question.
Oh, Mark. Yeah. Did you see Emmy's question here?
Yeah.
This is a great one for you. Have you noticed shifts in the poetry/literary world throughout your career? And if so, how have they affected your writing?
One or two, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I would talk about two different things. One being this gradual movement that's really gone on, it seems like my whole life, of democratization and opening up of what could be taken seriously, what could be read, and what was available. When I first was a student poet, it was the early 70s, I was an undergraduate in Tucson, Arizona, and everybody in that creative writing program read the same five poets. And we talked about those people, and we emulated them. I emulated them slavishly, like we were learning the style of that period. And it's so wonderful that can no longer be true, that there are worlds of poetry, expansive differences, huge, sort of, the vision in my head is of a kind of a mountain with enormous valleys and rifts that spread out in all directions. There are so many different geographies of poetry to explore, which I think is a thrilling thing. So that has happened. At the same time, I've been aware of a kind of pendulum swing that seems to operate all the time in American poetic culture, which is that we move between an interest in form and interest in content. So, for instance, I remember the new formalism of the 1980s, which, in response to poetry that was very autobiographical, very personal, and sort of a kind of free verse that, at its worst, could be very relaxed. Not too much tension, energy, and language. Formalism came and challenged us. Then something else came along to challenge formalism, and we moved through a period of a different kind of investigation of the self. Think about the poetry of feminism, poets by gay poets, by poets of color. Then appeared post-structuralism, and sort of every young poet was writing poems that were highly fragmented, not interested in representing experience, but in talking about language itself. At this moment, you kind of can't give a post-structuralist poem away in America, right? We have had a huge swing of interest back to the territory of content. That's probably just something that goes on and will continue. It's the way that poetry corrects itself over time. This correction is obviously a larger one probably than we've ever had. And that's an extraordinary thing to think that I think we owe it to the young who have decided we're done, we're finished with structural racism in this country. We're going to take that part. That's extraordinary. And it's going to have huge ramifications. I don't think it's just a flash of the moment. It is taking deep roots. It's really.
Yeah. I know. I'm so excited about this moment. Like, even just obviously, like, so beyond the world of poetry or literary anything. Like, I feel like literary fashions are fashions. And, like, sometimes you're in step with them and sometimes you're out of step with them. It's like, it might be a moment where, like, this one thing is happening, but something's happening in your life where you're like, I'm writing these poems. But then those poems, like, might get kind of popular like later or something like that. But just like everything that's happening now, like just the revolutionary like spirit of everyone is exciting. I mean, it's a tumultuous time to say the least. But I'm thrilled about it.
It's not easy. There's, for instance, at Rutgers, where I teach, there is a movement abroad to remove the statue of Walt Whitman from our campus in Camden because of racist remarks that Whitman made, and some things he said in his prose that were truly reprehensible. He's also, the person who wrote the great anti-racist poems of the 19th century. So it's like, how do you put those two things together? A lot of people who object to the statue object for good reasons and have never read his poems. So it's a really difficult area, and I don't think that we're going to sort this out quickly or easily, but I think we're going to push towards the root of something that shaped all our lives in this country.
Yeah. What have you guys been writing at all during this time? Are you like I'm curious about whether it's like it feels more like a time to like read and think, and or if you're more in a phase of, you know, just like frantically like creating things as much as possible. I wonder if you're like, you know, leaning into writing about everything that's happening in our culture right now, or if you're like leaning away from that. Like, have you taken up painting instead of poetry, or are you just like, I'm done with that, like I need to do something else? Tell me about like creativity during you know, the most awful political situation in America that we've lived through, or I've lived through. I don't, you know, talk to me about that.
Well, what I could say about it is I wrote a bunch of prose about the epidemic, about the lockdown, about what it felt like to be a citizen of a world epicenter of this pandemic and a city that was down to its knees. And I couldn't make poetry about that, but I could observe it in sentences, and that was kind of a lifesaver for me. I also found myself impelled to finish some poems that I have in the past that I can't write it. Mm. One of those, the poem of thinking about the death of Sandra Bland, the Texas. I think that's one of the worst and most painful stories that I know in my lifetime. And how to talk about it. You know, who am I to talk about it? What right do I have to speak? From what direction? How do I do that responsibly and ethically? And how do I also say what I feel about it without making the poem about me? And so I had sort of let that project just sit there. And I remember Major's marvelous essay some years ago in American Poetry Review about why aren't white poets writing about racism? And I have taken that essay to heart, and it's slow work. So I have a poem I'm very proud of about the killing of young man in Cleveland. His name went out of my head. A 12-year-old boy. You know who I'm talking about. Shot by the police because he was playing with toy cars in the park. And Tamir Rice. I'm sorry. The name's become more lovely these days. So I have a poem about Tamir Rice I believe in. I have this poem about Sandra Bland. It's a mess. But it's going to happen. It's going to happen because of the pressure of this moment. You know, you have to, you don't get to just shrug your shoulders and say, I can't do it.
Yeah.
I initially took the wrong route and found myself stuck between reading Belarusian news in the morning and American news in the evening, and being completely sucked into it and overwhelmed by language, by speeches, by all the noise, and it rendered me really mute and speechless. And so I'm right now in that moment where I absolutely lack words, lack language, but I also know that lacking language is the beginning of a poem for me, right? That's where something will begin. Out of this muteness, I know that I'm going to be writing. So it is, so I could say I'm working because I'm mute.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say powerful. That's the thing that makes it.
I really relate to that feeling so much too, Valjina. Yeah, it's like, I actually have been writing a lot, but there are other times where I'm insanely speechless and I can like feel it all brewing. I'm like, ooh, a poem's coming. It's like, it's such a, I know that feeling well. Talk to us, Major. Tell us everything.
Well, you know, I was thinking how much I treasure Mark's poem about Tamir Rice and how I've taught it, and thinking about my own muteness at that particular tragedy and subsequent tragedies, and grateful that Mark and others were able to give some clarity about that poem, about Tamir Rice's, the symbolism of that moment, which has me contemplate that question is so individuated. How do we respond? And what I'm realizing is that that whatever whatever reaction that we have to this moment is appropriate first. And secondly, if we contemplate the communal nature of art, particularly as it regards interpreting, as it regards to articulating, working through, engaging conversations that have preceded us, furthering those particular conversations, that's a communal, for me, a communal act. And so where speechlessness is found, someone may have clarity, and then someone else picks it up. It's more kind of a, I carry it to this point and you take it from there when you can. It may not be this particular moment. It may be further down the line. And let me just say, the risk of atrocious verse is okay. Most of it will be. I remember September 11th, which engaged in all acts of patriotism that is fretful to me. But there were poems that came out of it, several, that truly have staying power, and that I'm grateful as part of our record. So I'm looking at it less as, and I am writing right now with the realization that most of it probably should be buried somewhere. But I'm so moved by what is happening to us as a species. There is a great momentum towards decency that I could not have predicted 4 years ago, where it felt like there was a retrenchment. And I'm sorry that I regret that there are martyrs, both physical and also the earth is a martyr right now. And I think our poets, and I'm just so grateful for Valjeana and Mark, among others, who really render and create space in our lives that the news cannot. Going back to that first question.
I remember you mentioned Lucille Clifton's poems in your work, Major. I remember Lucille showing up at the Dodge Festival and pulling out of her purse this folded up piece of paper, which was a poem about that gentleman in Jasper, Texas. But it seemed like nobody could talk about that. That was an atrocity that we just left us numb and speechless. And there she was with that brave poem. And it makes me think about the antecedents of the kind of courage.
Yes.
It's been built. It's time. And everybody who was part of that. Did.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm so glad you were talking about Lucille Clifton, because I was thinking about her too when you mentioned her, and thinking about all of the writers that I would love to share with our viewers out there. It was a big question on my page. What writers am I missing? Who should I be reading? Who would you three recommend our viewers, our young poets, maybe novice poets, or people who aren't familiar with poetry? Lucille Clifton's always at the top of my list. June Jordan, there's so many great writers out there that I don't know. I don't want to say don't have the publicity that they should, because what is a famous poet really, but if you could give, your top few, or just a nice list for our viewers out there, who would you say people should look into?
I want to make a pitch for Gwendolyn Brooks, who was, people think of her as like a nice lady.
I have her collected works. It's like this big. It's incredible. You could open to any page at any time and feel the earth move.
Yeah, her formal acuity. Incredible strength, and innovative songs that she makes. She just does great things with language, both in terms of vision and technique. Not to be missed.
Yep. I'm going to just make the list and then we can post it later. Gwendolyn Brooks.
Oh, perfect.
It's just so many names. I feel like as a teacher, I'm like, what do you call it? I'm a matchmaker of sorts, and it would require me interviewing each person, like see where they are in their lives to kind of like match them to their poet. So, but one thing I will say is that American poets should not limit themselves to poets on these shores, and that they should realize that there's much to be gained from reading poets in great translation, not just good translation, but great translation. So I just want to kind of put a plug into poets. I feel like we used to do more of that. I feel like the reading public today is quite limited. There's a Chinese poet who I recommend, Jidi Majah, who's translated by Jack Hirschman out in California, but definitely.
Awesome. Valjina?
Yeah, an American poet that I really love and return to often, and that I do not think gets enough attention is J. Wright. And particularly his poems about Benjamin Banneker and his almanac, they move me deeply. And I wish that more people read J. Wright. And thank you so much, Major, for giving a shout out to American poets. I would say Adelia Prado is a Brazilian poet who writes just fantastic poems that wrestle with eroticism, religion, poetry, her working class background, and they're just overall great poems.
This question reminds me that I wanted to ask you, Valjina, if you're a Nazim Hikmet fan.
Yeah.
Yes, I love. Did you say Zbigniew Herbert?
Oh, I said
No, Nazim Hikmet.
the Turkish poet?
Did you say Hikmet?
Yes.
Yes. I love him. Yes.
I thought I could hear some like cadences or influences of that in some of the poems you read. They were beautiful poems, by the way, really moving. And the way you move from image to image, it feels Hikmetian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. Yes, and we read him from childhood, so it's somebody whose world I grew up in. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you too: is it the case that your language is challenged, suppressed, in some trouble?
Belarusian language. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it is. I don't even know where to begin. Yes, it is completely dominated by Russian because of the very long colonial history, where Belarus is just this very strange little territory in between larger empires, a Polish Empire and Russian Empire. And so just for centuries, Belarusians lived without any sense of identification. So when people would be, if people were asked who they are, what they identify as, they would just say that they're local and that they speak simple language, local language. Their language is simple, they're simple people, meaning just not imperial people, but stuck in between. And so since then, Belarusian language is associated with uneducated peasants. And so in order to have any kind of career or social climbing or place in the society, you had to speak, depending on what era it was, Polish or Russian. And so today, there is a very small percentage of people who speaks Belarusian daily, but most people can speak it, but they cannot overcome the prejudice against it. So it's Belarusians themselves who I think suppress it most. And it's this self-hate, really, because people would say, why do you speak it? I hate it. But how do you hate language? You might dislike it, you might not want to speak it. But why to use a word hate? You know that it's sickness and it's self-hate. And but all of these like post-colonial studies that are so important to a lot of Western colonies in their awakening, right? To us, they have been unavailable for a very long time because so few people can read in English and they're not translated. So it's very slowly that these things are coming in and people are changing. In fact, Black Lives Matter movement has a huge impact on Belarus and on Belarusian resistance, and a lot of language of that movement is borrowed and used. Yeah,
That's amazing. I actually have kind of a follow-up question for you, Valjina, from one of our interns, Saki, who wanted to know about your work with translation and writing in multiple languages, and if the process of translating other people's poems helps kind of inform your own poetry, and if there are differences between the way that you write in different languages and how that serves you as a creative human.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm really in a deep hole with these languages that I dug myself and put myself into. Because by now, I do not speak well, not a single language that I write in or speak in, for that matter. My Russian is not perfect, my Belarusian is not perfect, and my English is far from perfect. So I find myself just as a person who is moving between these three languages available to me, and I think of them as really just one language, because I need all three of them to sustain me at this point. But translation, yes, I live in translation. I think that that's the case for many immigrants in America. Major mentioned good translations of poetry, how they're important. But I also want to give a shout out to bad translations of poetry and say that as a translator and who often sits and compares two versions in English, for instance, of a Polish or a Russian poem, I really love bad translations. I think that we can learn a lot from them because we recognize the great struggle that the translator has and that English language has with a poem in a bad translation, really, really bad one, especially if the poem is famous. Like, you take something like Rilke, and my advice, find the worst translation of Rilke and see how hard it is for the translator to render Rilke into English. I think you learn a lot from that.
Taught a course in Rilke, but we started with like 18 translations of Archaic Source of the Apollo, because that was translated into English since 1920 or so. So you get like all the versions that are in American period style. So it sounds like an 80s poem or a 70s poem or a 90s poem. And some of them are just unbelievable. How much power a single word has.
What's gorgeous about that is your two things there. One, that identification I think is really important. And two, I'm moved by your positioning yourself between languages, because for me, that's the ideal lyric space to exist in, because it leaves you open to so many options of language rather than a kind of a single column.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Major, because it's true. I think that the poetic language, we find it on the margins of language rather than, yeah.
So, Valjina, when you were composing the poems that you read tonight, are they being written as we're hearing them now, or are they being written in three languages?
So they are written in English, and then I write them in Belarusian too. So I work on two drafts at once.
That my dog just unseated.
Fascinating. It's like my dog barked and your dog knocked over the camera.
No, did you guys see my cat before? He was like pushing my computer like off of the. Anyways.
This is the human interest of our program.
I think we have one question from Alex via Emmy. Here, let me pop it onto the screen here. And I think this might be maybe one more after this if we have time. It says, with your works being received and written about, is there anything around the public narratives of your work that you feel is not being said? What do you want people to know that they don't? Major, why don't you kick this one off?
Wow, wow. That leaves room for correctives as well as, there's criticism is very, very difficult. And particularly poetry critics have their job cut out for them. I think the most sensitive critics, or those who kind of help shape the public narratives of my work, are regrettably limited to what they inherit. And there's a great deal of, and I'm not, I take my cues from the poets that I read deeply and widely. There's a level of sophistication that I think when it comes to poets of color, most critics miss it. Or they refuse to kind of acknowledge. Jay Wright is an extraordinary poet who's widely read across multiple traditions, cultures, and it's the regret of, I think, both academia as well as the limitations of maybe even the form of criticism that doesn't acknowledge the expanse. And so, by the way, I am no Jay Wright. I'm not saying that at all. But even a poet like Gwendolyn Brooks will be discussing her work for the reach into human trauma, human ascension, regret. I mean, love. It's all in there. It's as wide as a Whitman, as studious as a Dickinson. And unfortunately, I just think public narratives are shaped, at least in the moment, but it may take a future reader to kind of really chip away at what is really there, the gold and ore that's really there.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Valjina, do you want to respond to this one?
Yeah, perhaps not necessarily for my work, but just generally. I love what Major is saying about the kind of criticism and the kind of readings I think that we're craving for. And here I would mention Mark's book on Walt Whitman that I read not so long ago, and how much I've enjoyed it. And it's exactly the kind of books about poetry that I enjoy reading, because it's not about how for an MFA student to read a poetry book, or how for somebody who aspires to publish a book to read a poetry book. Or it's about, look how much research I've done, a kind of a book. But it's about a human being who is living his life with poetry, with a poet accompanying him, right? Having conversations with this poet daily, and how poetry truly takes us out from the darkness that is us, right? And leads us to some kind of understanding of ourselves. And so that's the kind of reading of poetry, so-called critical reading of poetry, that I would like to see. Mm-hmm. How can I live with this poet as my companion? How does one live with a poet as a companion? How does this poet help you to walk you out of not understanding anything from this chaos of being you to some kind of clarity of being you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really honored by that. It's so much the book I wanted to write, about what it is to live by reading, and to take a particular artist's work as a guiding light, as an accompanying spirit, not necessarily a great spiritual teacher, because I think he was wrong about lots of things, but as a way to live one's life, and alert in a way, passionate and a compassionate fact. I'm just delighted by your.
Wow.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's, yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of just like criticism in general, I feel like I'm just always so curious about what other people think. Like, I guess, I don't know. It's like with poetry, you're saying something that's so mercurial and like complex typically, that it's just like, I wonder what this person is going to get out of it, essentially, and I'd love to know more about that. And with the events that we produce, I feel like we're with the Poetry Brothel in particular, but also the New York City Poetry Festival. A lot of people that come to that are just looking for something fun to do. It's not necessarily like your typical poetry audience and like other poets. And I think that a lot of people have the misconception that there is a way to understand a poem, and there's no way to understand a poem.
Yeah. What we find, and we make it for ourselves. So we can use it. It doesn't pre-exist.
Yeah.
You're mentioning your reaction to a poem and how someone else might react to it. I know that curiosity because I've had friendships with people for whom probably in my day-to-day life I would not necessarily connect with, except for either they mentioned a poet or they mentioned a poem, and without speaking, we could almost just kind of nod and agree that this was one of the significant encounters in our life, and thus a friendship, a brotherhood or sisterhood, or was suddenly born. A gentleman who I'm friends with, we both maybe 2 weeks prior had encountered a poem, and we were both sitting. We didn't know each other. We were sitting at the counter in a delicatessen, and he just mentioned this poem, his friend, and suddenly I knew that this was kin. Valjeana once mentioned the poet Yanis Ritsos in a particular book, and I was just like, she's my sister for life. You don't even remember that moment, but I just remember, like you said, Ritsos. Yes, late into the night. And I was like, nah, yes. When Mark wrote about Whitman and Camden, I was like, nah, yes. So that curiosity is a way in which, art kind of like creates, and like, I was mentioning about matchmaking. It does that for us, and it's fun. Going back to your,
if you're reading a poem that's been people have been reading for 200 years, you are speaking with those readers. In a community context, people's lives and shape of song. Listen to Vale's not. All of Vale's not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. I
Incredible.
I love all of you so much. Is that okay to say? It's like
There is, I think poetry does that magic that brings us together, brings that connection, and brings out the love. We need more love, especially now and always. So I just feel so much love and so much gratitude for all of you, and for Poetry Society and Blue Flower for making this happen and bringing poetry and all of these incredible voices of the present and the past, to life.
When you talked about You talked about the Poetry Society bringing in people who don't necessarily love poetry already. I remember going to the poetry brothel and there being 200 people who had paid $25 for their tickets to go to a poetry reading.
That's right.
It's true. Yeah, it's so much fun, and I miss that so much. I mean, for me, it's like this pandemic and everything. It's so hard to not have like people in the room, like all sharing poetry together and like talking. And I'm glad that we're doing this, because it helps. It helps a lot. I love talking to other poets, and I love talking to non-poets about poetry as well. And I think we all do. I mean, we're all obsessed with poetry, right? I feel like we all like think about it basically all day, every day.
Yeah.
And so many of us are teachers too. So bringing those voices, to the younger generation so that they can carry it with them in their hearts and bringing it, further and further to the generations to come.
Absolutely. So yeah, I hope everyone who's watching has enjoyed themselves. I hope you'll join us for all of our events that we will be holding in 2021, whether that's like outdoors and socially distanced and lots of masquerade events or not. We will see. Join us next week for our virtual reading. Wednesday, April 12th, we're going to be featuring Paul Muldoon, Ariana Rines, C.A. Conrad, and Deborah Landau. And we love all of them so much. Also, you got like Major, Mark, Valjina. I hope you come and hang out on that one. That would be great.
Yeah. We'll be there.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for being here and chatting with us. It's been such a pleasure.
So wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, friends. So good to see you.
Mwah.
Au revoir.
Good night. Aw, great job, everybody.
So good. Thank you.